Some men spend their whole lives trying to prove they belong at the table. I spent mine quietly building the table, then watching very carefully to see who pulled out a chair and who stood in the corner, deciding who was worthy of sitting down. My name is Gerald Marsh. I am 67 years old. I live in Columbus, Ohio. Have lived there for 41 years, in the same house on Delwood Avenue that I bought in 1983 for $74,200, a number I remember precisely because I saved every dollar of that down payment myself, $200 at a time, in a coffee can I kept behind the water heater. The house has a front porch with 2 chairs and a view of a maple tree I planted the spring my daughter Claire was born. The tree is taller than the house now. I notice that every morning, specifically at 6:47, when I bring my first cup of coffee outside, winter permitting. It is one of the more reliable things in my life, and I have a long list of reliable things, so that is saying something. I am retired, technically. I spent 31 years as a design engineer at a mid-sized manufacturing firm in Westerville, Ohio, a company called Harmon Structural Group, which most people have never heard of, and that suits me fine. Harmon made precision load-bearing components for commercial construction projects across the Midwest, and I spent 3 decades solving problems that, if solved incorrectly, cause buildings to lean or staircases to buckle or parking structures to develop the kind of hairline cracks that become, over time, a different kind of problem entirely. I was good at the work. I was patient at the work, which is different. I learned early that most engineering failures are not failures of intelligence. They are failures of attention. People get impatient. They round numbers. They assume. I do not round numbers. I do not assume. Before I retired, I spent the last 9 of those 31 years at Harmon quietly acquiring commercial property in Franklin County on the side, beginning with a single mixed-use building on Broad Street that I purchased in 2003 for $1,140,000 with 2 partners. One of those partners was Dale Pritchard, my college roommate from Ohio State, class of 1978, who had gone into commercial lending and had the specific useful quality of knowing which properties were distressed before the market did. The other partner was a man named Howard Fenn, my direct supervisor at Harmon from 1987 to 1993, who became my closest professional friendship over the following 30 years. Howard had exited his own engineering role by 2001 and was managing a small private investment portfolio. He was the one who first looked at the Broad Street building and said the words that I have thought about many times since. "Gerald, the numbers don't look like much right now. That's why we should buy it." Howard was right, as he usually was about things that required patience. By the time I retired in June of 2019, the portfolio had grown to 7 properties across Franklin County, with a combined assessed value of $8.3 million and an estimated market value somewhere north of $9.6 million based on comparable corridor sales. I do not talk about this. I want to be precise. I do not talk about this at all. Not at family dinners, not at neighborhood gatherings, not in particular social moments where men sometimes feel compelled to establish their dimensions. I drive a 2007 Ford F-150, dark blue, 141,000 miles, with a dent above the left rear wheel well from a parking garage pillar in August of 2014. I have been meaning to get that fixed. I probably will not. The truck starts every morning. It gets me where I need to go. That is a complete description of what I require from a vehicle. Welcome to Dad's Raw Revenge. Get comfortable, because this one is going to take you somewhere. Drop a comment, and let me know where you're watching from. Hit that like button, and make sure you're subscribed. Trust me, you're going to love it here. My daughter Claire met Brandon Kowalczyk at a professional conference in Chicago in March of 2017. She was 34. He was 38. He worked in commercial real estate development, the acquisition side, which meant he spent his days evaluating properties, modeling returns, and constructing pitches for investor groups. He was good at this work. I say that without qualification and without resentment. Brandon Kowalczyk was a competent, ambitious, well-prepared professional who had built a legitimate career through legitimate effort. I want to establish that clearly, because what I am about to tell you is not a story about a fraudulent man. It is a story about a careless one. Claire loved him. That was initially sufficient for me. They married in October of 2018. The ceremony was at a venue outside Delaware, Ohio, Brandon's Selection, a restored barn property that cost more per hour than my first monthly mortgage payment. I wore a suit I had owned since 2009 and had dry cleaned the week prior. It fit well. I have maintained a consistent weight since 1994, which attributes to our morning walks, and I attribute to not eating past 8 p.m. Brandon noticed the suit. He said nothing about it to me, which I appreciated. I found out later from Claire that he had made a comment to her the following week, something about the photographer's candid shots, something about first impressions, and that she had told him, in terms that I gather were direct, to leave it alone. She has her mother's judgment and her grandfather's threshold for nonsense. I was not worried about Claire. What I was watching, with the methodical patience of a man who has spent his career studying load tolerances, was Brandon. The first 2 years were unremarkable. He called me Gerald, never Dad, never Jerry, with a particular enunciation of man who treats first names as territorial markers. I called him Brandon. He and Claire bought a house in Worthington, which is a fine neighborhood and a reasonable investment for their income bracket. He was advancing at his firm, moving from associate to senior director, beginning to develop his own client relationships rather than executing under senior partners. When we had family dinners, he talked about work in an expansive way, a man who has recently discovered he is good at something and has not yet learned to be selective about the audience. I listened. I asked questions. I ate my food. My wife liked him in the measured way of a woman who had been married to a quiet man for long enough to recognize that not everyone is quiet for the same reasons. She found him charming in small doses. She watched him the way I watched him, though she would not have used the word methodical. She would have used the word patient, with a particular expression that meant she was being generous. The shift began in the spring of 2021. Brandon had reached a stage in his career where his confidence had overtaken his curiosity, which happens to a lot of capable men around that age, and is not necessarily permanent. He had begun to speak at family gatherings about his professional world with the authority of a man explaining a subject to people who do not share his advantages. He talked about cap rates and leverage and market timing in the tone of a man translating for an audience that has not yet grasped the fundamentals. And then there was Easter Sunday, April 11th, 2021. We were at the table, myself and Claire, Brandon, and Brandon's mother Diane, who had driven up from Chillicothe and was a perfectly pleasant woman who talked about her garden and asked no one to explain leverage to her. We were midway through the meal when Brandon began talking about generational wealth. Specifically, he began talking about the ways in which men of my generation had missed structural opportunities that his generation understood how to exploit. He used the phrase passive asset accumulation. He used the phrase miss window. He was not addressing me directly, which somehow made it more specific. I said, "Is that right?" He said it was, and looked at me across the table. I looked at my plate. Diane asked if anyone wanted more of the green bean casserole. I want to be honest about something. What I felt at that moment was not anger. I have been asked this question by Dale, by Howard, eventually by Claire herself, and the answer has been the same every time. It was not anger. It was something quieter. Something in me went very still. The way a building goes still when all machinery inside it stops at once, and you suddenly become aware of the structure itself, the weight, the load, the way everything is resting on everything else. I noticed the feeling. I did not examine it further. I set it on the table, in my mind, the way you set a tool down when you are not yet ready to use it. I let it sit. Over the spring and summer of 2021, I watched with the same attention I had once given to fracture points and tolerances. Brandon made comments about the truck. The first was in the driveway in July. "Still driving that thing, Gerald?" With the comfortable familiarity of a man who has decided you are settled company. The second was in August at Claire's birthday dinner. "How many miles on that now?" Accompanied by the small smile of a man who considers the answer evidence of a larger argument he is winning internally. I told him the miles. I did not elaborate. He referred to my house, my home of 41 years, where Claire learned to walk and wherein I sat on the porch every summer evening from June through September as the original house, as though it were a prototype. He said it once to a colleague of his at a neighborhood event we both attended in September, and I happened to be standing 6 feet away and heard it clearly. The colleague nodded politely. I moved to refill my drink. He used a phrase at part of Columbus to describe Delwood Avenue. I have turned that phrase over in my mind many times and have never fully decoded it to my satisfaction, but its direction was unmistakable. None of this was malicious. I want to say that again because I believe it and because it is important to the shape of what happened. Brandon was not a cruel man operating with intention. He was a man operating on autopilot, inside a story he had told about the world, and in that story I was wallpaper, useful wallpaper, father-in-law, respected for Claire's sake, present at the appropriate occasions, but wallpaper. Men who are wallpaper in someone's story do not have cap rates. They do not have Franklin County property portfolios. They do not have attorneys on Gay Street with 19 years of practice and floor-to-ceiling bookshelves. They have 2007 F-150s with dents in them. He was, entirely and without suspecting it, wrong. On the evening of November 14th, 2021, a Sunday, I sat down at my kitchen table at 7:18 p.m. The dishes were done, and had gone to read. I made a pot of coffee I did not need and poured 1 cup and let the rest sit. I opened a legal pad I keep in the second drawer, the one I have kept in that drawer since 1991. Always a fresh pad, same brand, same yellow paper, and I wrote, in my standard column format, a list of facts, not grievances. Facts. Properties, assessed values, current market estimates, partnership structure, LLC designations. The timeline of Brandon's comments, dated and specific. Not because I needed them documented, but because I am a man who writes things down and finds the act of writing clarifying. When I was done, I looked at the list for several minutes. Then I picked up the phone and called Dale Pritchard. Dale was 69 years old and still sharp in the way of a man who never fully retired from paying attention. He listened to everything without interrupting, which he had always done in the 18 years we worked together, and which remained one of the qualities I valued most in him. When I finished, there was a pause of 4 seconds. I counted out of habit, and then he said, "What do you want to do?" Not a question. Dale rarely used questions when statements were more efficient. I told him what I wanted to do. It took approximately 3 minutes. He said, "I'll call Patricia in the morning. If you have been listening for a while, do us one quick favor. Subscribe. A lot of people watch without ever doing it, but it costs you nothing, and it means everything to us. Hit the like button while you're at it, and drop your thoughts in the comments." Patricia Shun, and Aldrich Commercial Law. 1147 North High Street, Short North District, Columbus. 19 years in practice. Howard Fenn's son-in-law had used her in a partnership restructuring in 2018 and had described her, in exactly these words, as the most prepared person in any room she has ever entered. I had not met her before November 16th, 2021, but Dale had twice, and he trusted her completely, which carried significant weight with me. She is a small woman, precise in her movements, with dark hair worn straight and a way of sitting at a table that suggests she's calculated exactly how much of it she requires, and is using no more. Her office has bookshelves from floor to ceiling on 3 walls and 1 framed photograph on the desk, not visible from the client chair, which I suspected was intentional. She had already pulled the public records on all 7 properties before I arrived. She had 3 questions written at the top of her legal pad. I answered the first 2 before she finished writing the 3rd one. She looked up. She said, "You've thought this through?" I said, "For some time." She said, "All right, let's talk about structure." What Patricia outlined over the following 90 minutes was precise and unhurried. The 7 properties were held through 2 LLCs, Marsh Pritchard Holdings, LLC, and FFD Properties, LLC, the latter named for Fenn, a man named Fitzgerald, who had been a 3rd partner and had exited cleanly in 2014, and Dale. The total assessed portfolio value, $8.3 million. Estimated market value based on current corridor comparables, $9.6 million. No liens on 5 of the 7 properties. The 2 with remaining mortgage balances carried a combined outstanding debt of $614,000 against assets worth approximately $2.9 million. Everything was in order. Everything was filed. Everything was, as Patricia noted with a slight pause, publicly accessible to anyone who searched the Franklin County records. She said that last part without inflection. I said, "Yes." She said, "And the relevant party has not searched." I said, "He has not." She looked at her legal pad for a moment and then back at me, and I got the impression she was reassessing something slightly. She said, "What is it you actually want out of this, Mr. Marsh?" I told her. I said I did not want harm. I said I did not want humiliation as an end in itself. I said what I wanted was clarity, a specific, documented moment in which certain assumptions were corrected by facts witnessed by people whose professional judgment Brandon respected, in a setting where theatrics were not possible and the numbers had to speak entirely for themselves. Patricia said, "That's a very precise objective." I said, "I had been an engineer for 31 years. She almost smiled. Almost. We met 3 more times between November and January. What Patricia produced across those meetings was a restructuring of the holding arrangement, consolidating Marsh Pritchard Holdings and FFD Properties into a single entity, Marsh Holdings, LLC, with Dale and Howard as named minority partners and myself as managing member. This had been functionally true for years. Patricia's work made it formally, unambiguously, documentably true. She also, at my specific request, prepared a letter of introduction on Shun and Aldridge letterhead. 1 page. Managing member, Marsh Holdings, LLC. 7 properties listed by address, square footage, and approximate current market value. Total portfolio figure included. Signed by Patricia. Countersigned by me. It was a factual document. It was not designed to impress. It was designed to be legible to a commercial real estate professional in approximately 45 seconds. Patricia asked me how I intended to use it. I told her I was waiting for the right occasion. She said, "Of course you are." She put the letter in a folder. She said if I needed anything else to call her directly. The occasion arrived on March 4th, 2022. Brandon had called me in early February to extend an invitation. He was hosting a dinner at a restaurant downtown, a working dinner. 2 potential investors he was cultivating for a new mixed-use development project, a 44,000 square foot building. He was pitching on the north side of Columbus, near the Fifth Avenue corridor. He wanted, he said, to introduce me to some people. He used the phrase, "show you my world a little." He said it with the generous ease of a man doing someone a favor. I said I would come. He thanked me. He sounded pleased. I spent approximately 1 week after that call doing something Brandon did not know I was doing, which was looking at the site plans for his North Side project, which were part of a zoning application that was a matter of public record. The proposed building sat on a parcel whose eastern boundary ran along a fence line. The fence line was mine. Specifically, it bordered the northeastern edge of a property I had purchased in 2009, a 4-unit commercial building on Linwood Avenue that was currently leased to 3 tenants and had, as of the most recent appraisal, a market value of $1.4 million. I noted this information on my legal pad. I called Thomas at Provision on 5th on the afternoon of February 28th. Thomas was the maitre d'. I had eaten at Provision on 5th twice before and had spoken with Thomas on both occasions. He was a careful, professional man who did his job with the specific, quiet competence I have always admired in people who are good at things that go unnoticed. I explained that I was attending a dinner there on March 4th. I explained that I was expecting a document from my attorney's office, and that I would appreciate it if he could place it at my setting when I arrived, in the same kind of slim folder the restaurant used for checks, without announcement or introduction beyond my name. Thomas said he would arrange it. I said I appreciated it. He said it was no difficulty at all. I arrived at Provision on 5th on March 4th at 6:27 p.m. The temperature was 31 degrees. I wore my wool blazer and the gray button-down I had ironed that morning. I parked the F-150 in the surface lot adjacent to the building. I did not use a valet. I have never used a valet in my life. Through the front window of the restaurant, I could see Brandon at the table with 2 men I did not yet know. He saw me cross the lot. By the time I pushed through the door, he was already on his feet and moving toward me, with the expression of a man who has just registered something unexpected and is reorganizing on the move. He stopped in the entryway. He looked past me toward the parking lot. He said, "Gerald, you made it. Is that your truck out there?" "The blue one." I said it was. He said, "That's your car?" He said it with the laugh already built in, the comfortable laugh of a man on familiar ground. That old thing. His two guests had turned in their chairs. The restaurant was quiet enough that the laugh traveled. One of them, the larger of the two, smiled reflexively, the way you smile when the host laughs. Before knowing why, I looked at Brandon. I want to be exact about my expression. It was neutral, not cold, not warm. The expression of a man who is watching events proceed on a schedule. He set himself and finds them proceeding on time. I said, "It gets me where I need to go." We sat down. Brandon made introductions with the practiced ease of a man who runs meetings for a living. His two guests were Kevin Stahl, principal at Stahl Capital Partners, a mid-market equity firm based in Dublin, Ohio, which I'd already looked up, and Arthur Dietrich, a private investor from Cincinnati who had backed two of Brandon's previous projects and whose name appeared in two Franklin County transaction records I had reviewed the previous week. They were both professional, focused men. Kevin Stahl had the particular quality of a man who has been in enough bad deals to listen carefully before committing to anything. Arthur Dietrich was quieter, with the practiced stillness of a man who has learned that the person who speaks least in a room frequently understands it most. I recognized both qualities immediately. The conversation moved to the project. Brandon presented it well. I will say that without qualification. He had the site plans, the zoning timeline, the projected rental income broken down by unit type, the comparable vacancy rates for the corridor. He had clearly spent considerable time preparing, and the preparation showed. Kevin Stahl asked sharp questions. Brandon answered them directly. Arthur Dietrich said little and watched everything. At some point, Brandon gestured toward me with the comfortable inclusiveness of a man acknowledging a guest who has nothing to add. He said, "Gerald is Claire's dad, retired engineer, great guy to have in the room." I said, "Design engineer." He said, Right. He moved on. Kevin Stahl asked a question about a competing parcel 3 blocks north. Brandon answered. Arthur Dietrich asked about the zoning variance timeline. Brandon answered. The conversation was competent and specific, and I listened to all of it and said nothing and drank my water and waited. Thomas appeared at my left elbow at 7:44 p.m. He placed a slim folder on the table in front of me, the same kind the restaurant used for checks, unremarkable black leather. He said, at a volume calibrated precisely for my ears and the two men adjacent to me, "Mr. Marsh, from Ms. Shun's office, as requested." I said, "Thank you, Thomas." He nodded and withdrew. I opened the folder. I removed Patricia's letter. 1 page, Shun and Aldridge letterhead, dated February 26, 2022. I did not read it aloud. I did not call for attention. I set it flat on the table and slid it without a word to Kevin Stahl, who was the closer of the two to me. Kevin Stahl read it. He read it once, then went back to the top and read it again. I watched his eyes move. He is a careful reader. He took approximately 30 seconds on the second pass. Then he turned and slid it to Arthur Dietrich. Arthur Dietrich read it. He looked at the letterhead. He looked at the property list. He looked at the total figure at the bottom. Then he set the letter flat on the table in front of him and looked at me and then at Brandon, and then back at me, with the specific expression of a man who has just located a variable he had not previously known was in the equation. The table was quiet. Kevin Stahl said, "Gerald, these properties. 2 of them are in the 5th Avenue corridor." I said, "That's right." He said, "The Broad Street address in the Linwood?" I said, "The Linwood property." "Yes." Arthur Dietrich leaned forward slightly. He said, in a tone that was careful in the way of a man choosing his words with professional precision, "Are you familiar with the specific parcel Brandon has been targeting for this development?" I said, "We share a fence line." There was a silence. I counted 4 seconds. Brandon had not moved. He was sitting with both hands flat on the table and his water glass in front of him and his presentation materials stacked neatly to his left, and his face had the expression of a man who has just discovered that the building he thought he was standing in has a different foundation than the one on the blueprints. Not anger, not embarrassment, exactly, though that came later, privately, and I believe genuinely. It was the expression of a man recalculating. the particular vertigo of a person who has been applying one set of measurements to a structure built on another scale entirely. I had seen that expression before. In engineering reviews, when a colleague presented a load assumption and the numbers came back wrong, the moment before defensiveness sets in, when there is still just a pure, unmediated recognition that you got something important incorrect. I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. I picked up my water glass. I took a drink. I set it back down on the white tablecloth. I looked at Kevin Stahl and said, "Tell me more about the zoning variance timeline. I have some familiarity with that particular review board." The dinner continued for another 2 hours and 11 minutes. Kevin Stahl asked me 11 questions over the course of those 2 hours. I answered all of them and asked for my own. Arthur Dietrich, who had been the quieter of the two all evening, became considerably less quiet. He had an interest in the history of the Linwood property's commercial tenancy, which I was able to address specifically and with dates. He had a question about the fence line parcel setback requirements, which I answered from memory and offered to confirm in writing. Brandon participated. I want to say that in fairness, he recovered professionally and he re-engaged, and he did not make the error of trying to explain or contextualize what had just happened. He presented 2 additional elements of his pitch with the composure of a man who has decided that the meeting is still salvageable and is correct about that. I respected it. I helped him where I could, which was several times, genuinely. I did not mention the truck. I did not mention Easter dinner. I did not mention leverage or passive asset accumulation, or that part of Columbus. I had coffee, black, the way my father drank it, and I was present and specific and direct. And when the evening ended, I shook both men's hands and thanked Thomas on my way out. In the parking lot, Brandon and I stood for a moment in the cold air beside my F-150. His car was 3 spaces over, a 2021 Audi A6, silver, very clean. I have no objection to Audis. He said, "Gerald." I waited. He said, "I didn't know." I said, "I know you didn't." He stood there for a moment with his hands in his coat pockets. He said, Why didn't you say anything?" I looked at the truck. I put my hand on the door handle. The metal was cold. I said, "You didn't ask." I drove home on 670 West, exiting at Cassidy, then surface streets to Delwood. I arrived at 9:41 p.m. The porch light was on, and was in the kitchen reading with the radio on low. I came in, and she looked at me over her glasses. I said, "It went fine." She said, "How fine?" I said, "Completely." She got up and made us both chamomile tea, the specific kind, bagged steeped for exactly 4 minutes, the way she has made it since 1987, and we sat at the kitchen table until nearly 11. I told her enough that she understood. She listened without interrupting, which is one of the things about, and that has never changed in 43 years of marriage. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Thomas placed it right?" I said, "Right where I asked." She nodded. She said, "Good." That was the entire conversation. It was sufficient. The following Monday, March 7th, Patricia Shunn received a call from Kevin Stahl's office requesting a formal meeting. That meeting took place on March 14th at Shunn and Aldridge's offices on North High Street. Dale Pritchard drove in from Powell. Howard Fenn drove in from Dayton, 2.5 hours each way, at 71 years old, because Howard has never missed a meeting that mattered. Patricia was present. Kevin Stahl attended with his director of acquisitions. Brandon was not invited to that meeting. He was informed of its outcome by Patricia, who called his firm on March 15th as a professional courtesy. What resulted from that meeting and 2 subsequent meetings in April was a formal consulting and access agreement, a documented arrangement under which Marsh Holdings, LLC provided development access to the Linwood property's eastern boundary, including a specific easement and a right of first refusal clause on the adjacent parcel, in exchange for a minority equity position in Brandon's North Side project. The terms were negotiated by Patricia over 3 weeks and reviewed by Dale before execution. They were fair to all parties. They were, in Patricia's words, exactly the kind of arrangement that makes a project viable that was not viable before. She said this to me in a phone call on April 21st, 2022, at 4:15 in the afternoon. I was on the porch. The maple tree was in full leaf by then. Brandon called me on April 2nd, 2022 at 9:15 a.m. I was drinking my first cup of coffee on the porch. The morning was cold but clear. He said, "Gerald, I want to apologize." He said it plainly, without construction, which I respected. "I made assumptions about you, about what you were, and I was wrong. I've been wrong for a while." I let him finish. He spoke for approximately 4 minutes. He was genuine. I could hear it. The specific, unguarded quality of a man who's arrived at something uncomfortable and has decided to stand in it rather than around it. I said, "Brandon, I appreciate that. I mean it." He was quiet. I said, "You've built something real. That's not a small thing. Claire's proud of you." "I am in my way." He said, "I didn't know who you were." I said, "You still don't entirely, but we have time. That's the point of the whole thing. Really, we have time." I have thought about that conversation many times in the 3 years since. It was the most honest exchange Brandon and I have had. I think it was the beginning of something better, which is what I had actually wanted all along. If I am being truthful about it, not the dinner, not the letter, not Patricia's document or Thomas's placement of it, or Kevin Stahl's 30-second second read. What I wanted was a son-in-law who looked at me and saw a person rather than a prop, and who did so because the facts required it, and because he was, underneath the carelessness, a man capable of that kind of reckoning. He is, I believe, that man. He is becoming more of it. Brandon Kowalczyk is, today, a decent son-in-law. He is still capable of the occasional comment about the truck, which I no longer mind in the way I once did. I now have a second dent above the right rear wheel well from a different parking garage. I find I have grown rather attached to both of them. He works harder at the dinner table. He asks questions before delivering conclusions. He called me last Thanksgiving to ask my advice about a mixed-use parcel in Dublin, and listened to the answer with the specific attentiveness of a man who has recently updated his model of the world and is still integrating the implications. I gave him the advice honestly and at no charge. Claire is happy. That is the whole structure of everything I did. Not the portfolio, not the dinner, not Patricia Shin's one-page letter on Shun and Aldridge letterhead, or the slim folder Thomas placed beside my water glass at 7:44 on a cold evening in March. Claire is happy, and my granddaughter, their daughter Josephine, whom they call Josie, who is 4.5 years old, and has her mother's eyes and her grandfather's habit of watching everything carefully before she speaks. Josie comes to Delwood Avenue on Sunday mornings. We sit in the 2 chairs on the porch. She tells me things about her week. I tell her things I think she should know, which is different from what people expect a grandfather to say, and which she always listens to with the gravity of a very small person who has decided to take the world seriously. The maple tree is taller than the house. Everything is exactly where it needs to be. I still drive the F-150, both dense, full tank. The most dangerous thing in the world is a man who could live any way he wants and quietly choose the simple. A 2007 Ford F-150 in a surface lot off Fifth Avenue. A one-page letter in a slim black folder. A maitre d' named Thomas who placed it exactly where I asked at exactly the right moment, without a word of explanation. Some men spend their whole lives trying to prove they belong at the table. I built 7 of them. If you enjoyed this story, join our community by hitting that like button and subscribing for more real, raw, and family-centered stories. And as always, thank you for being a part of Dad's Raw Revenge. I will see you on the next one.